Paul Howes, welcome to the program. Can I just say this? Whenever I speak to the business community, one thing that seems to come up all the time are these complaints about trade unions, which had been in abeyance for a while, but are now here and really full on. And what I'm getting is firstly that there seems to be complaints about wages and conditions, about productivity, and even about strikes again. Now, how have we got to this situation? Let's take them one by one. What are we doing with, say, productivity? Everybody is telling me that the productivity is just lousy at the moment. We're getting no improvements.
Well, we've had a glut in productivity growth for almost 2 decades now. Really, since the mid-1990s, we've seen a massive decrease in productivity growth. Now, we saw that under the Howard government. We've seen that under the Labor government. We saw it under work choices, but we're also seeing it under the Fair Work Act. And I think the problem with the productivity debate in Australia is that we focus a lot on IR regulation, where every single labour market economist can tell you IR regulation is only one small ingredient in productivity growth. What we actually need to look at is the real causes behind the lag in productivity growth. That's issues about skills and education. It's issues about management and worker cooperation. There's lots of lessons to be learnt from Europe and from other advanced economies on how you can actually spur the growth of productivity, but it's not going to happen through ideological debates which seem to be taking place at the moment.
You know, everyone seems to focus only on one thing, and that is if you tighten up the Fair Work Act and make things tough, then it'll all get better.
Well, but the evidence isn't there to back up that argument. As we saw, productivity growth actually slowed faster under work choices than it did under the Fair Work Act. So if the argument is that you need a completely deregulated labour market to be able to spur productivity growth, then why did productivity growth decline faster under work choices? The real answer is actually in what we've done in the past. If you look back historically for when we did have good periods of productivity growth, particularly during the Accord, when you were a minister in the Hawke and Keating governments, that was through developing cooperative workplaces and focusing on skills and focusing on areas where we can work together rather than using productivity as a kind of race to the bottom, which it is at the moment.
It certainly is, but let's look at something where there is plenty of evidence around. If you look at wages and conditions, and you take, say that just as one site, but it's a very big one, that desal plant in Victoria, it's almost brought a massive company like Leighton's to its knees. And the stories of wages and conditions there really do make your hair stand on end. What do we do about that, particularly at a time when inflation is so low?
Well, I mean, there's a very mixed picture with wages at the moment. I mean, I'm over here with my delegates from the aluminium industry. Now, if you look at the bargaining outcomes in manufacturing sectors like aluminium, you're not seeing massive increases in conditions like you had maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But of course, in the construction industry, yes, you are seeing some very substantial increases in wages and conditions. Now, that's the nature of a deregulated labour market. One of the things that always amuses me when you have kind of IR zealots or employer organisations, come to me and say, well, this is outrageous, the kind of terms and conditions that are being achieved in construction. My response is, well, this is the system that you guys asked for. I mean, you guys were the guys that lobbied against centralised wage fixation. You wanted a deregulated labour market. Now, the outcome of a deregulated labour market is that when labour is in short supply and the work is all around, then, of course, wages go up. The inverse applies, when the economy changes, but that's just the nature of supply and demand economics. And the nature of bargaining at the moment is such that if an employer can't afford to pay the wage increases, they don't have to, because bargaining is bargaining, and we don't have arbitration in our current industrial relations system. Ironically, something that the employers also fought against. Now they're asking for it to come back. So you need a bit of consistency from the other side of the table, I think, when you're looking at these issues.
Yeah, but it's not quite true in all cases. I mean, when I look at the example I gave you, I mean, really, there were unions there with a gun at the employer's head. I mean, because they were in a pretty powerful position. And so, when you say it's a bargain, it's not much of a bargain if you really haven't got much of a say.
Well, the Wonthaggi desal plant was a particularly troublesome site. I mean, there was a whole range of issues on that site. Frankly, Leighton's employing spies to bug the phones of union delegates and to put listening devices in lunchrooms didn't really help for good industrial relations on that site either.
I think
there's a
whole range.
Yeah, there's a whole range of issues that plagued Wonthaggi. Now, you can point to some examples of sites that have massive industrial disputation like Wonthaggi, but you can also point to huge resources projects right across the country that are being built on time, under budget, in fully unionised environments with no lost time. And that's when you have good examples of cooperative unionism and you have examples of the parties working together to get the job done. And that's certainly what our union's always about. I don't like seeing members of the AWU out on the grass. It's not in our interest to have members losing wages. I view it's our job as a union to get as much money as possible for our members and to make them happy at work. And by having as little industrial disputation as possible is how you do make members happy at work. And that's what we always strive to do. But sometimes, you know, in the case of Wonthaggi, it was very tough when you had some pretty downright dirty tactics being employed by the employers there.
What about the Bowen Basin, where I note your predecessor in your job is up there at the current, right at the moment, trying to sort things out?
Well, Kelty's not my predecessor. He was ACTU rather than the AWU. But
no, Bill Shorten flew there yesterday.
Oh, did he?
Yeah,
oh, right.
He did.
Okay. I don't keep up with Bill as much as you do, Graham. But,
obviously.
Look, that's a pretty nasty dispute there. I think BHP, Mitsubishi alliance has underestimated the strength of the union members there in the coalfields. I know that Bill Kelty is undertaking a mediation in that dispute at the moment. I'm hopeful it gets resolved. That's not my union, so it's not appropriate for me to comment on the specifics of that dispute. But frankly, I think what I've seen of the demands of the CFMEU mining division in that dispute are pretty reasonable, and it's pretty unreasonable for a company the size of BHP, making as much money as they do out of the Bowen Basin, to be pretty measly and mean about some pretty basic conditions. And the fact that time and time again 90% plus of the workforce have voted to take industrial action demonstrates that this isn't about union thuggery or union bosses. This is about workers on the shop floor being pretty pissed off about companies like BHP treating them just as a number.
Yeah, I understand that sort of thing happens, but of course what people will focus on, what headlines will be about how many hundreds of millions of dollars are being lost, and that always is a problem.
Yeah, but my understanding of that dispute is that the BHP Mitsubishi alliance have basically refused to come to the table and negotiate in good faith with the unions. Now, as I said, it's not my union, so I'm not, intimately familiar with the details of that dispute. But it takes two to tango. You can't resolve disputes if one party won't come to the table, and I think a large amount of that dispute revolves around an inability to negotiate. Now, my understanding is, and it's a informal understanding, is that negotiations are progressing well with Bill Kelty's involvement, and if Shorten was up there, that's good news as well. But obviously, I'm just a bit cautious about commenting too specifically on that dispute because it relates to a different union. All right,
well, let's look at some things more generally, like Australian manufacturing and where it's heading. You saw the closure of that maintenance plant down in Melbourne just in the last week.
LTQ,
and I understand that that's part owned by Lufthansa, but nonetheless, it's a huge problem because you just get more people laid off. You saw what happened at Ford, and I have no doubt that'll happen again at Ford and at the others. I mean, manufacturing in the car industry is really struggling. And you mentioned aluminium. Well, you had only, a few weeks ago, you had Curry close, and that again is a worry because that really is about the world price of aluminium. How do you sort those things out?
Well, manufacturing's in a very bad way at the moment. Victoria is being hit for 6. You had the very near closure of Point Henry. Thankfully, we've got a small reprieve there. But LTQ being lost out of Tullamarine, that's a real blow. And frankly, I'm very disappointed with Qantas in this regard because, time and time again we get reassurances from Qantas that they don't intend on cutting further maintenance jobs, but time and time again we see more maintenance jobs being lost. Now, you're right, that is a joint venture with Lufthansa, but Qantas are also a part owner there. They're the Q that is in LTQ. Losing Kurri was devastating. I was just with our members from Kurri last night. That's the first aluminium smelter that's ever shut down in Australian history. And aluminium is an industry which before the GFC we thought was almost untouchable in terms of its ability to be profitable and to expand here in Australia. That's why today I've launched a new plan for the aluminium industry. Our union is going to be campaigning very strongly about many of the major issues that are affecting aluminium, because you're right, the global price on the London Metals Exchange is the primary driver of the unprofitability of many of our facilities. Couple that with our soaring exchange rate, it's a recipe for disaster. But we really can't afford to allow this industry to fall over. If we're not adding value to our bauxite by refining it into alumina and then smelting it into aluminium, then our economy is going to be in a really precarious state in decades to come. And that's why we need to look at issues about gas reservations. I mean, the soaring price of gas on the east coast of Australia and the west coast is a huge issue for all of our manufacturing companies. The fact that it's now around $9 in Victoria and New South Wales is devastating. And whilst the gas industry and its expansion in Gladstone and, of course, in Western Australia and northern New South Wales is a real positive for our economy, frankly, we need to be talking now about how can we reserve some of that gas for our own production back in Australia.
But see, we talk about all these problems now, Paul. I remember you talking about getting some of the mining companies to buy Australian steel. There's not much evidence that's happening either. Whichever way you try to help Australian manufacturing, it just doesn't seem to work.
Well, you actually need to do the work. I think the government has done some good work in terms of procurement policies, and Peter Beattie is running a program at the moment with the mining companies trying to get greater procurement of Australian-produced goods. That's a positive thing. Jason Clare's overhaul of our anti-dumping system is another positive, and of course the Prime Minister's task force on manufacturing has been working quite well together to look at those issues. But you're right, Graham. I mean, the nature of the Australian economy is shifting so dramatically and so fastly that it's hard for large parts of the economy to catch up. But we need to remember that there's almost 1 million Australians employed in manufacturing today. When you add food production in there, it's 1.4 million Australians. If you compare that with 200,000 Australians in the resources sector, it shows that whilst manufacturing may not be having the huge impact on the GDP that the resources industry is, it certainly is the most labour-intensive part of our blue-collar economy. And we can't allow it to fall over because, frankly, the jobs just won't be there in the resources sector to mop up losses out of manufacturing.
But
that's why we've been...
No, I understand that, but can we keep pouring money into things that just seem doomed to fail, like the car industry? You know, we whacked a heap of money into that, and Ford have broken their word, but then again, Mitsubishi did that some years ago. Won't it just keep happening?
Well, there's a difference between having good industry policy and just having lots of ambulance passes. You know, I don't like going to Canberra constantly asking for handouts for struggling companies. I'd actually rather we have more proactive policy in the first place to get the policy settings right to have a viable and thriving manufacturing industry. That's why, you know, things like we're talking about today in terms of gas reservations policy, that's not about government handouts, that's not about the taxpayer footing the bill. That's about making sure that we manage our natural resources in such a way that, yes, we continue to develop our export markets for our raw commodities, but we also ensure that we use some of our natural resources to develop our own economy internally, that we add value to our natural resources and that we have a diversified employment sector. And that's where I think government can play a stronger role instead of looking at manufacturing as being about, you know, signing blank cheques to keep jobs here and looking at more through the prism of how do we get industry policy right to ensure we have a diversified economy. Now, we've done it before. Labor has done it before. Well, hell, Graham, you're a part of it. You know, with the button industry plans in the 1980s and the 1990s, that saved Australian steel manufacturing then. It saved the automotive sector. It saved the aluminium sector. That's what I think we need to do again now, because companies aren't going to be able to do it on their own. I don't think we can just leave it to the market. There is going to be a role for a strong government assistance and intervention to ensure that we steer the economy in the right path. It's the whole nature of Keynesian economics.
It's what we all desire. It's just really hard to achieve. Look, we have to leave it there, but no doubt we'll talk again. Maybe one of the answers is you getting in there and doing some more about it. I think it may be time you shifted, you know.
Mate, I'm pretty happy where I'm at, and I'm running for re-election next year, so I'm keen to do that first. But I appreciate the support, Graham.
OK, thanks. Paul Howes in
See you,
Perth.
mate.
We'll be back in just a moment.